Who is to blame for all of this? If you hadn't lost all that money, I wouldn't be suffering like this. On the grounds of an ancient estate in the outskirts of Providence, a freezing wind howls as three daughters-in-law sit collapsed before a mountain of ingredients. Catherine, the eldest, hurls a head of cabbage in a fit of rage, oblivious to the frostbiting cold, while Megan, the second, flings her rubber gloves to the ground in defiance. At that moment, Eleanor, the mother-in-law who had been staring blankly at the sky from the porch, slowly turns her head. "Children, is there gold hidden in the roots of that cabbage? Why are you digging through it like that?" With those words from her hollow, unfocused eyes, the air in the yard freezes instantly. But in that fleeting second, a shadow of a smile flickers across Eleanor's lips. The elderly woman, who they thought was lost to dementia, was secretly smiling at the chaotic sight of her children tearing each other apart for her wealth. While the women desperately dig through the dirt and the sons grab each other by the collars to argue over inheritance shares, this family gathering has turned into a battlefield. Who will lay their hands on the real golden cabbage Eleanor has hidden away? Or will this family even survive the night to share a single meal together? Welcome to our channel. Before we begin this heartfelt story, please subscribe and like this video. Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from so we can send our warmest wishes your way. Now let us begin today's story. In the historic heart of Providence, Rhode Island, the morning arrived not with a sunrise but with a thick silver shroud of fog that rolled off the Narragansett Bay. It was a mist so heavy it seemed to swallow the red brick facades of the colonial houses and the cobblestone paths of Benefit Street, turning the city into a ghostly memory of its 18th century self. High above the muffled streets, the iron bells of the old First Baptist Church tolled with a low, mournful resonance, their vibrations shivering through the damp air and reaching the frost-tipped windows of the Blackwood estate. Within the manor's walls, the scent of aged cedar and floor wax hung heavy, a silent companion to the woman who sat motionless by the parlor window. Eleanor Blackwood, 78 years of age, possessed a face that was a map of a life lived with fierce dignity. Her silver hair was pinned back into a neat, albeit slightly loosened bun, and her hands, though spotted with the pale marks of time, remained steady in her lap. To anyone watching, her pale blue eyes appeared vacant, fixed on the last few crimson maple leaves that clung desperately to the skeletal branches outside. She looked like a portrait of fading light, a queen losing her kingdom to the encroaching fog of the mind. In reality, Eleanor had never been more present. As the heavy tires of an expensive vehicle crunched on the gravel driveway below, Eleanor felt a sharp internal ripple of focus. For months, she had allowed the world to believe she was slipping away. She had mastered the art of the lingering pause, the misplaced word, and the hollow stare. It was a protective mask, a GD technique designed to cause strong emotions in those who truly cared, and to expose the rot in those who did not. She was an unlikely hero in her own house, playing the part of the victim to become the savior of her family's legacy. The front door groaned open, and the house was suddenly filled with the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels and the rustle of expensive silk. "Mother, are you in there?" The voice belonged to Catherine, the eldest daughter-in-law. Catherine was a woman who wore her status like armor. She was tall, impeccably groomed in a tailored wool coat, with a face that had been smoothed by expensive creams, but hardened by a permanent expression of dissatisfaction. She entered the parlor with a practiced air of concern, followed closely by Megan. Megan, the middle daughter-in-law, was a study in calculated sweetness. She was shorter, with bright, overly curled blonde hair, and a wardrobe that was always a bit too trendy for her age. She carried a designer bag like a weapon of war and wore a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "She's still in the chair," Megan whispered, her voice carrying that artificial softness people use when they think they are talking to a piece of furniture. "She hasn't moved an inch since the fog set in." Eleanor did not blink. Inside, she was a silent voice, observing the soul connection, or lack thereof, that transcended their language of greed. She watched them through the periphery of her vision. They hadn't come for her. They had come for the 30 acres of prime Providence timberland and the Blackwood name. We have 300 pies to bake for the charity drive, Catherine, Megan said, though her eyes were wandering to the antique silver tea set on the sideboard. The church expects them by the morning of Thanksgiving. It's a miracle-based tradition, supposedly. If you believe God still performs miracles, these pies are meant to prove it. She chuckled dryly, a sound that lacked any religious empathy or faith. The only miracle I'm looking for is her signature on the deed before she forgets how to write her own name, Catherine snapped, her voice losing its faux warmth. She walked over to Eleanor, leaning down so close that the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume threatened to break Eleanor's composure. Mother, it's Catherine. We're here to help you with the baking. Eleanor allowed her jaw to slacken just a fraction. She turned her head slowly, her gaze drifting past Catherine toward the fireplace, where a framed photograph of her late chong, Henry, sat. In the photo, they were young, standing on the cliffs of Newport, their laughter captured in a sun-drenched moment. The memory hit her like a blurred film reel, the way he smelled of sea salt, the strength of his hand in hers. It was a transformation hook of memory, a journey from the pain of the present back to the happiness of the past. The tea is cold, Martha, Eleanor whispered, her voice thin and reedy. Catherine froze. Megan let out a sharp, stifled gasp. Mother, what did you say? Catherine asked, her brow furrowing. Who is Martha? Eleanor turned her vacant eyes toward Catherine, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Don't dawdle, Martha. The linens need pressing before the master returns from the shipyard. And tell the cook we'll need more cinnamon for the tarts. Martha had been the Blackwoods' housekeeper 40 years ago. By calling her daughter-in-law the name of a long-dead servant, Eleanor had struck the perfect emotion-based hook. She watched the shock register on Catherine's face, followed by a dark, shimmering gleam of satisfaction. Catherine didn't look heartbroken. She looked relieved. To Catherine, this was the evidence she needed, the justice and redemption she sought for her husband's failing business. If Eleanor was truly gone, the land would be theirs to silence the truth of their debts. She's completely lost it, Megan whispered, stepping closer, her eyes wide. She thinks it's 1975. It's perfect, Catherine murmured, her voice a low hiss. She won't even know what she's signing. We'll tell the lawyers the symptoms started months ago. Just then, the back door opened, and a much softer sound entered the house. Clara, the youngest daughter-in-law, walked in. Unlike the others, she wore a simple denim jacket and a hand-knit scarf. Her face was fresh, unadorned by the heavy mass of the city, and her eyes held a genuine, grounded warmth. She carried a basket of fresh apples from the local market. I'm sorry I'm late, Clara said, her voice a calm melody in the tense room. The bus was delayed by the fog near the bridge. Catherine and Megan turned to her with looks of pure condescension. Oh, Clara, Megan sighed. You've missed the excitement. Our hero here has finally lost her grip on reality. She thinks Catherine is the help. Clara dropped her basket, the apples thudding softly on the Persian rug. She rushed to Eleanor's side, kneeling on the hardwood floor without a thought for her clothes. She took Eleanor's cold hands in her own warm ones. Eleanor, it's me, Clara, she whispered. She didn't look at Eleanor like a problem to be solved or a bank to be robbed. She looked at her with the deep emotional connection of a daughter. Are you okay? Do you want some warm cider? Eleanor felt the genuine heat from Clara's touch. It was the only real thing in the room. For a second, Eleanor's GD mask slipped. Her fingers gave a nearly imperceptible squeeze to Clara's hand. But she couldn't stop now. The justice and redemption of her family required the wicked to be punished and the good to be rewarded. More cinnamon, Martha, Eleanor repeated, staring blankly over Clara's shoulder. And fetch the girl some water. She looks like she's walked a long way. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her heart breaking, just as Eleanor had intended for the technique to work. But Catherine and Megan were already moving toward the kitchen, whispering about land surveys and power of attorney. As the fog pressed against the windows of Providence, the battle for the Blackwood heart had begun. Eleanor sat in her chair, a silent sentinel in a house of mirrors, waiting to see who would believe in the miracle of family and who would be restored by faith, and who would simply try to steal the silver. The morning fog in Providence did not lift. It merely thickened, turning the Blackwood estate into an island of gray stone in a sea of white. Inside the grand kitchen, the air was already heavy with the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and the fine choking dust of flour. For Eleanor, this scent was a transformation hook, a sensory bridge leading back to a time when these walls echoed with the laughter of children and the warmth of a life well lived. But for Catherine, the eldest daughter-in-law, the atmosphere was nothing short of a personal affront. Catherine stood by the heavy oak kitchen island, clutching her tailored wool coat as if it were a shield against the domesticity surrounding her. She looked at the mounds of dough and the crates of apples with a curled lip. Catherine was a woman who defined herself by the price of her accessories, her sharp features always tightened by the stress of maintaining a high society facade that was rapidly crumbling. "This smell," Catherine muttered, waving a manicured hand in front of her face. "It's seeped into the lining of my coat already. It will take a week at the cleaners to get the scent of cheap cinnamon and flour out of these fibers." "It's for the charity drive, Catherine," Clara said softly from the sink, her hands stained red from peeling apples. "The church is counting on us. It's a miracle we can help so many people this year." Catherine let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her eyes devoid of any religious empathy or faith. "A miracle? The only miracle I'm interested in is finding a way to pay off the bank before the auditors arrive at the office. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to take an urgent business call." Catherine didn't wait for a response. She pivoted on her heels and swept out of the kitchen, her silk scarf fluttering behind her like a battle flag. She didn't head for the veranda or the gardens. Instead, she navigated the dim, quiet hallways toward the back of the house, her destination clear: the late Henry Blackwood's private study. As she walked, she pulled her phone from her designer bag and dialed her husband, Arthur. Her voice was a low, jagged whisper. "Arthur, I'm at the house. The situation is better than we hoped. The old woman is completely disconnected. She called me the housekeeper today." On the other end, Arthur's voice was strained, the sound of a man drowning in $1 million of debt. "Does she still have the keys, Catherine? The bank called again this morning. They're threatening to freeze the corporate accounts." "I'm going into the study now," Catherine replied, her eyes darting to the shadows. "The 30 acres of timberland on the North Ridge. We can sell it to the developers the moment she's gone. It's the only way to silence the truth of what you've done. I'll find the deed and the safe key. Just stay by the phone." She ended the call and slipped into the study. The room felt like a tomb, preserved in amber. Henry's heavy mahogany desk sat in the center, covered in a fine layer of dust. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. A justice and redemption hook played out in reverse as she sought to reward her own greed at the expense of the family's history. She began to move with a frantic, silent efficiency. She pulled at the top drawer. Locked. She tried the side panels, her fingers fumbling with the ornate brass handles. She muttered curses under her breath as a stray puff of dust settled on her sleeve. "Where is it, you old crow? Where did you hide the keys to the kingdom?" She moved to the bookshelves, tilting the leather-bound volumes of maritime law, hoping for a hidden compartment. She was so consumed by her search, so certain of her own cleverness, that she failed to hear the soft, rhythmic click-clack of a cane on the hallway floor. She failed to notice the shadow that elongated across the Persian rug as the study door creaked open an inch wider. Catherine knelt by the bottom drawer of the desk, pulling it open with a sharp tug. It was filled with old ledger books and yellowing maps. She began to toss them aside, her silk sleeves dragging through the grime. "Are you looking for the butterscotch, Martha?" The voice was thin, airy, and seemingly devoid of any weight. Catherine let out a strangled yelp, her heart leaping into her throat as she scrambled to her feet. She spun around, her hand clutched to her chest, her face a mask of pure terror. Eleanor Blackwood stood in the doorway. She looked frail, her silver hair illuminated by the dull gray light filtering through the window. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her head tilted at a curious, bird-like angle. She looked like a woman who had wandered out of a dream and couldn't find her way back. "Mother!" Catherine gasped, her voice trembling. You startled me. I was just checking for a draft. These old windows, you know." Eleanor didn't seem to hear the lie. She took a slow, shuffling step into the room, her cane tapping the floor with a hollow sound. She looked at the open drawers and the scattered maps with a vacant smile. To Catherine, she appeared to be the perfect victim of a silent voice hook, a soul-transcending language because her mind was supposedly gone. "Henry always kept the butterscotch in the silver tin," Eleanor whispered, her gaze drifting to a corner of the desk Catherine hadn't searched yet. "He said a sweet tongue makes for a sweet heart. Are you looking for a candy, dear?" Catherine swallowed hard, the blood rushing back to her face. The shock had passed, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a cold, calculating relief. The old woman really was gone. She was standing in the middle of a ransacked room and thought her daughter-in-law was looking for candy. "Yes, Mother," Catherine said, her voice dripping with a sugary, fake affection. "A candy. I just thought a little sweet would be nice for our afternoon tea." "So thoughtful," Eleanor murmured, her eyes lingering on Catherine's hand, which was still gripping a heavy brass letter opener. "But the tin is empty, Martha. It's been empty for a very long time." Eleanor turned around, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to shuffle back toward the hallway. "Come along. The flour is waiting. 300 pies won't bake themselves, and the church expects a miracle." Catherine stood frozen in the center of the study, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the desk, then at the retreating figure of the woman she intended to dispossess. For a moment, she felt a flicker of something. Not guilt, but a chilling realization of how close she had come to being caught. She quickly shoved the ledgers back into the drawer and straightened her coat, wiping the dust from her silk sleeves. She hadn't found the key yet, but she had confirmed one thing. The unlikely hero of the Blackwood estate was no longer a threat. Eleanor Blackwood was a hollow shell, and the 30 acres of timberland were as good as sold. Catherine walked out of the study, her heels clicking louder than before, a predator once again convinced of her dominance. She didn't see Eleanor stop at the end of the dark hallway. She didn't see the vacant look vanish from the old woman's eyes, replaced by a gaze as sharp and cold as a Providence winter. Eleanor Blackwood was not looking for candy. She was looking for the truth, and she had just found it. The kitchen of the Blackwood estate had become a stage where the air was thick, not just with the scent of cloves and rising yeast, but with the suffocating weight of pretense. Outside, the Providence fog had turned into a cold, biting drizzle, streaking the window panes like tears on an old woman's face. Eleanor sat at the small breakfast nook, her hands resting near a bowl of flour, her eyes maintaining that hazy, distant look that had become her fortress. She was the silent voice in this room, a soul observing the connection, or the jagged lack of it, between the women who claimed to be her family. Megan, the middle daughter-in-law, was moving with a frantic, theatrical energy. Unlike Catherine, who stood aloof and complained of the mess, Megan had rolled up her silk sleeves and was leaning heavily into a large wooden trough of dough. Her face was flushed, a few stray blonde curls stuck to her forehead with sweat and flour. To a casual observer, she was the picture of the devoted transformation hook, a woman moving from a life of leisure to one of hard, sacrificial service. "Don't worry about the heavy lifting, Eleanor," Megan called out, her voice a high-pitched trill of manufactured sweetness. "I've got the strength for it. You just sit there and remember the beautiful things. I'll make sure every one of these 300 pies is perfect for the church. It's a miracle we're all here, really." Megan's performance was not for Eleanor's heart, but for her pen. She believed that by positioning herself as the unlikely hero of the kitchen, she could secure a specific piece of the Blackwood legacy that Catherine had overlooked, the sprawling stone carriage house and the adjacent storage barns. Megan paused, wiping her hands on an apron that was far too clean for the work she was claiming to do. She leaned in toward Eleanor, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, Eleanor, the North Carriage House is falling into such disrepair. It breaks my heart. If you just signed a small note, just a scrap of paper, really, giving me the authority to manage it, I could restore it to its former glory. It would be a miracle for the estate." Eleanor didn't move. She allowed a single trail of flour to slip through her fingers, her gaze fixed on a spiderweb in the corner of the ceiling. Inside, she felt a cold shiver of justice and redemption. Megan wasn't looking to restore history. She was looking for a title she could leverage into a high-end wedding venue business to settle her own spiraling credit card debts. The swinging door to the kitchen creaked open, and Catherine stepped back in, her face pale and her eyes darting toward Eleanor, with a mixture of suspicion and lingering fear from their encounter in the study. "Still at it, Megan?" Catherine asked, her voice dripping with irony. "I didn't realize you were so fond of manual labor. Or are you just trying to sweat out the stress of your husband's latest investment failure?" Megan's hands stiffened in the dough. She turned to Catherine with a sharp, jagged smile. "At least we still have investments, Catherine. I heard the bank was looking quite closely at Arthur's corporate accounts in the city. I'd be careful about complaining about a little flour when your own house is made of such thin glass." The two women stood on opposite sides of the long oak table, a mountain of unformed dough between them. They began to work, or pretend to, their movements sharp and aggressive. They were like players in a justice and redemption hook, each waiting for the other to stumble so they could claim the moral high ground. "Eleanor is quite far gone today," Catherine remarked, glancing at the old woman. "She thought I was Martha earlier. She's a silent voice now, Megan. There's no point in trying to talk her into giving you the carriage house." "We'll see," Megan snapped. "The miracle of this family is that we haven't all strangled each other yet." As the afternoon light began to fail, a new figure entered the kitchen. It was Officer Silas Vance, a man in his early 60s with a rugged, weathered face and a deep, booming voice. Silas had been a friend of the Blackwood family for decades, a man who believed in the call to faith and the old world values of Providence. He was dressed in his uniform, his hat held respectfully in his hand. "Afternoon, ladies," Silas said, his eyes immediately finding Eleanor. He walked over and gently patted her shoulder. "How are you holding up, Eleanor? The church is already setting up the long tables for your pies. They're calling it a miracle-based event this year." Eleanor tilted her head, giving him a vacant, watery smile. "The fog is very thick, Silas. Tell Henry to keep the lanterns lit on the porch." Silas sighed, a look of genuine, emotion-based heartbreak crossing his features. He looked at the daughters-in-law, his expression hardening. "Take good care of her. She's the heart of this city." When Silas left to help unload more crates of apples, the tension in the room snapped back into place. Catherine reached for a rolling pin, but as she moved, her silk scarf caught on the edge of the table. She yanked it back impatiently, and for a split second, something bright and green flashed in the light of the overhead lamp. Megan's eyes, ever observant of luxury, narrowed instantly. She didn't say a word. She waited until Catherine moved to the pantry to fetch more sugar. Megan stepped over to where Catherine had been standing and looked down at the floor. Tucked into a crevice of the floorboards, having slipped from Catherine's pocket during her frantic search in the study, was Eleanor's prized emerald-cut jade ring, a piece of history that symbolized transformation and personal growth for the Blackwood women. Megan picked it up, the cold stone humming in her palm. Her first instinct was to scream, to call for justice and redemption, and expose Catherine as a thief. But then a darker, more unlikely hero thought took hold. Catherine returned from the pantry, her face tight. Megan waited until Clara had stepped into the cold room to store the finished crusts. "That's a lovely shade of green, Catherine," Megan said, her voice a low, lethal purr. "Almost the exact color of the jade ring Eleanor used to wear, the one she said she'd lost years ago." Catherine froze, her hand instinctively going to her empty pocket. Her face went from pale to a ghostly white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Megan held up her hand, opening her fingers just enough for the jade to catch the light. "I think you do. I think you found this in the study while you were looking for butterscotch. This isn't just a ring, Catherine. This is leverage." "Give it to me," Catherine hissed, stepping forward. "Oh, I'll give it to you," Megan replied, her eyes glittering with the justice and redemption of a blackmailer. "But first, you're going to help me convince Eleanor to sign over the carriage house. And you're going to stop breathing down my neck about the safe. If you don't, I'll call Silas back in here and tell him exactly what's in your pocket." Catherine looked at the ring, then at Eleanor, who sat mere feet away, seemingly lost in a silent voice trance. The eldest daughter-in-law's shoulders slumped. She was trapped. Eleanor, beneath her mask of white hair and vacant eyes, felt a surge of emotion-based fury. She had watched the entire exchange in the reflection of the dark window pane. Her family wasn't just breaking. They were devouring each other like wolves in silk. She closed her eyes, a call to faith rising in her chest. The fire was coming, and she would be the one to light the match. The Providence fog had transitioned into a bone-chilling rain that drummed against the window panes of the Blackwood estate like a relentless, rhythmic warning. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed flour and the sharp, acidic tension lingering from Catherine and Megan's confrontation. Amidst this heavy atmosphere, the back door creaked open, admitting a gust of wet air and a woman who seemed to carry a different light entirely. Clara, the youngest daughter-in-law, stepped inside. She was the unlikely hero of the family, though she would never claim the title. While the others had arrived in luxury vehicles, Clara had traveled across the city by bus, her modest coat damp from the walk up the driveway. She was a woman of quiet strength, with eyes that held a depth of sincerity and a face that had not been hardened by the pursuit of status. To the older, religious viewers who often watched the family's journey, Clara was the living embodiment of a call to faith. She didn't glance at the mahogany furniture or the silver tea sets with greed. Instead, her eyes went immediately to Eleanor, who sat in her high-backed chair, still wearing the mask of a silent voice. Clara rushed to her side, kneeling on the cold floor. "Eleanor, you're shivering," Clara whispered, her voice a silent voice hook that emphasized a soul connection transcending language. She took a clean, warm cloth and began to gently wipe the beads of sweat and flour dust from Eleanor's brow. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The bus lines were stalled in the mist." While Catherine and Megan stood by the pantry, whispering like conspirators about deeds and carriage houses, Clara began a transformation hook of her own, a journey of healing through service. She moved with a practiced, humble grace, ignoring the mountains of unbaked pie crust to focus on the woman she loved. She began to prepare Eleanor's favorite pumpkin soup, the aroma of roasting squash and sage slowly fighting back the cold, stagnant air of the kitchen. As the soup simmered, Clara sat by Eleanor's feet, holding the old woman's hand. Eleanor remained limp, her eyes fixed on the rain, but she was listening. "Do you remember the first Thanksgiving I spent here, Eleanor?" Clara asked softly, her eyes filling with a lyrical, reflective light. "I was so nervous. I had never cooked for a family like this. You took me into this very kitchen and told me that a recipe is just a map, but love is the compass. You taught me that every meal is a prayer, a way to show my husband that he is seen and cared for. You taught me how to grow through the hard seasons." It was a transformation hook, a miraculous change from the pain of Clara's early, uncertain years to the happiness she had found in Eleanor's wisdom. Eleanor's hand gave a nearly imperceptible twitch in Clara's grasp. Inside, the silent voice was screaming with love, but the mask had to hold. "I made the soup just the way you showed me," Clara continued, her eyes searching Eleanor's vacant ones with genuine worry. "Please try to take a little. It will restore your strength." The moment was interrupted by Catherine's sharp, jagged voice. "Stop coddling her, Clara. She doesn't even know who you are. She thinks I'm the maid, remember?" Catherine and Megan stepped forward, their faces illuminated by the dim kitchen light. They had spent the last hour in a justice and redemption standoff over a stolen jade ring, and now they sought a common target for their frustration. "We're going to the city to meet with the lawyers and Arthur," Megan lied, her voice an unlikely hero hook twisted into a mask for her own savior complex. "The charity drive requires 300 pies by dawn. Since you're so fond of love being the compass, you can handle the baking. We'll be back to help with the transport, eventually." They didn't wait for an answer. They swept out of the house, leaving Clara alone with a mountain of dough, 3 crates of apples, and a woman who appeared to be slipping into the void. The night deepened. The old Providence clock tower struck midnight. Clara didn't complain. She tied her apron tighter and began the monumental task. One by one, she peeled, sliced, and crimped. The kitchen became a sanctuary of labor. As she worked, she began to sing. It wasn't a popular song, but an old soaring hymn, a call to faith that she had learned in her childhood church. "If you believe God still performs miracles, this story will restore your faith," she sang softly, the words of the miracle faith-based hook filling the rafters. Her voice was a silent voice that understood every tear Eleanor had shed in silence over the years. Clara prayed as she worked, her voice rising in a call to faith that invited the unseen audience to engage with a deep emotional connection. "Lord, watch over her," Clara whispered between stanzas. "Restore her mind if it be your will. Let her know she isn't alone in the fog." Eleanor, sitting in the shadows just beyond the light of the stove, felt a transformation hook in her own soul. She watched the youngest daughter-in-law through half-closed lids. Clara's back was aching, her hands were stained with juice and scarred by the peeler, yet she continued to sing her call to faith. Eleanor felt a tear escape her eye and track slowly down her wrinkled cheek. It was a miracle faith-based moment. She was a silent voice witnessing a miracle of pure, unadulterated love. Clara wasn't baking for a deed or a carriage house. She was baking because she believed in the miracle of the Blackwood legacy. Catherine and Megan thought they had silenced the truth by abandoning Clara. But as the 300th pie was laid out on the cooling rack, a little girl's memory and a dog's loyalty, symbolized by Eleanor's own resolve, proved them wrong. The justice and redemption was coming, but for now there was only the smell of cinnamon and the sound of a silent voice praying in the dark. The rain that had plagued Providence all evening finally surrendered to a bitter, biting cold. As the clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning, the droplets froze mid-air, turning into heavy, crystalline flakes of snow that began to blanket the Blackwood estate in a deceptive, silent white. Inside the manor, the warm, holy scent of Clara's baking still lingered, a silent voice of love that Catherine and Megan chose to ignore as they huddled in the darkened mudroom. Catherine had traded her designer heels for a pair of old, mud-caked garden boots she'd found in the garage, though she refused to part with her ruined silk scarf. Megan stood beside her, shivering in a thin puffer jacket, clutching a rusted spade she had scavenged from the tool shed. They were no longer the polished socialites of the city. They were hunters driven by a justice and redemption hook, though the justice they sought was purely for their own bank accounts. "Are you sure about the location?" Megan whispered, her breath hitching in the freezing air. "If we're caught out here, Clara will tell Silas, and we'll be finished." Clara is half asleep on the kitchen floor, surrounded by flour. Catherine hissed, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "I saw the old woman staring at the carriage house earlier. She kept muttering about the gold in the roots. It wasn't just dementia, Megan. It was an unlikely hero hook, a secret savior for our debts buried right under our noses." They slipped out the back door, the wind howling through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks. The snow was falling in earnest now, thick and blinding, a transformation hook that turned the familiar gardens into a treacherous, unrecognizable landscape. They trudged toward the rear of the estate, where a massive, gnarled oak tree stood like a sentinel near the edge of the woods. This tree was a silent voice of the Blackwood history, its roots entwined with the secrets of a grandfather who had once been the city's finest jeweler. Rumors had persisted for decades that he had buried a cache of raw gold and unset stones during the Great Depression, a miracle, faith-based hook for a family that might one day face ruin. "Start here," Catherine commanded, pointing to a patch of earth between 2 massive, protruding roots. The ground was partially frozen, requiring them to throw the full weight of their bodies onto the spade. Megan dug with a desperate, frantic energy, her manicured nails snapping under her gloves, her face splattered with icy mud. Catherine knelt beside her, using a hand trowel to claw at the dirt. The emotion-based hook of their greed had stripped away every layer of their sophistication. "I hit something," Megan gasped, the spade striking wood with a dull, hollow thud. They both fell to their knees, clawing at the earth like starving animals. They unearthed the corner of a small, rectangular wooden box. It was rotted and slick with moisture, but to their eyes it looked like a miracle. Catherine gripped the lid, her knuckles white, and wrenched it open. But as the lid gave way, there was no shimmer of gold. There was no glint of diamonds. Inside the box, protected by a layer of waxed canvas, were several pairs of tiny scuffed leather shoes, the first walking shoes of Arthur, Mansu, and Kyungsu. Beside the shoes lay a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Catherine snatched the top letter, her eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script of Henry Blackwood. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "the shipyard is quiet tonight, and my heart is full of the miracle of our boys. We have little in the bank, but as long as we have this earth and our faith, we are the richest souls in Providence. It was a miracle faith-based hook of pure parental love, a testament to a transformation journey from poverty to a life of rich meaning. To a soul like Clara, these would have been a silent voice of priceless value. "Shoes!" Megan shrieked, her voice cracking in the wind. "Old letters and baby shoes. Is this a joke?" Catherine's face contorted with a justice and redemption hook gone wrong. She felt a surge of emotion-based fury so potent it blinded her to the beauty of the sentiment. She kept this? She kept these rags while we're facing bankruptcy? In a fit of pique, Catherine grabbed the bundle of letters and flung them into the wind. The white pages fluttered like dying birds through the falling snow. Megan grabbed the tiny shoes and threw them toward the dark tree line, her face a mask of bitter disappointment. "She's a silent voice of nothing but trash," Megan cried, hot tears of rage melting the snow on her cheeks. They stood in the deepening snow, two silhouettes of failed greed, while the rotted box lay empty at their feet. They didn't notice the second-story window of the manor, where the curtain moved almost imperceptibly. Eleanor Blackwood stood in the dark, her silent voice observing their cruelty from above. Beside Eleanor stood Barnaby, a massive, aging golden retriever who had been Henry's constant companion and was now Eleanor's only confidant. Barnaby was an unlikely hero hook, a dog who understood every tear Eleanor shed and every secret she kept. Eleanor placed a hand on Barnaby's head, her eyes cold as the Providence ice. "If you believe God still performs miracles, Barnaby, then watch closely," Eleanor whispered, her voice no longer reedy or frail, because she thought she could silence the truth, but a little girl and a dog will prove her wrong. Eleanor watched as Catherine and Megan trudged back toward the house, their shoulders slumped in defeat, leaving the miracle of the family's past to be buried by the winter storm. The call to faith was being answered, but not in the way the greedy Dao Trung and Dao Thu had imagined. The justice and redemption was no longer a hope, it was a plan. The morning following the midnight storm broke with a sky the color of cold pewter. In Providence, the snow had stopped, leaving the Blackwood estate draped in a heavy, suffocating white. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was far from serene. The kitchen, once a sanctuary of Clara's hymns and the scent of baking, had been transformed into a cold courtroom. 300 pies sat in perfect rows, a miracle of labor completed in the dead of night. But no one was looking at them with gratitude. Catherine and Megan had returned from their failed excavation with frozen marrow and scorched spirits. They had spent the dawn hours in the guest wing, huddled over a space heater, their conversation a jagged justice and redemption hook. They weren't mourning the baby shoes or the lost letters they had scattered in the snow. They were calculating their next move to silence the truth of their own desperation. "We'll tell the probate judge she's a danger to herself," Catherine whispered, her voice a low hiss. She had changed into a sharp navy blue dress, her stolen jade ring tucked deep into her pocket. "After that stunt in the study and her calling me Martha, we have all the leverage we need." "And the carriage house," Megan added, her face tight. "If we don't get that land, Arthur's creditors will be at our door by Monday." Eleanor, draped in a thick wool shawl, sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table. To her left sat Clara, her eyes red-rimmed from the overnight vigil, her hands trembling as she poured tea. To the right stood Barnaby, the unlikely hero dog, his low growl vibrating in his chest whenever Catherine or Megan approached. Also present was Father Thomas Moore, the parish priest from the First Baptist Church. A man with a gentle face and eyes that had seen decades of human frailty, he had arrived early to collect the pies for the miracle faith-based charity drive. He sensed the emotion-based tension in the room, the heartbreak hidden behind the silver service. "Eleanor, dear," Father Moore said softly, "the community is so grateful for these pies. They are a sign that God still performs miracles through people like you." Eleanor didn't answer. She stared at a large ceramic bowl filled with white flour sitting in the center of the table, a remnant of the 300-pie marathon. Her eyes were still fixed in that silent voice gaze, a vacant stare that Catherine and Megan took for total mental collapse. "Father, I'm afraid she's not quite here," Catherine said, standing up and leaning over the table. She's had a miraculous change from pain to happiness, perhaps, but she's lost to the world. We're discussing a transformation hook, moving her to a specialized care facility in the city. You can't do that, Clara cried, her voice a call to faith that invited the others to see the deep emotional connection they were severing. She belongs here, in Providence, with her memories. Memories, Megan scoffed, her voice dripping with the justice and redemption of a predator. She doesn't even know her own name. She's a silent voice that's finally gone quiet. The argument erupted like a sudden storm. Catherine and Megan stood across from each other, their voices rising as they began to fight openly about the inheritance. They spoke as if Eleanor were a piece of furniture, a silent voice that couldn't understand every word. I get the Northridge, Catherine shrieked. Arthur's debts are 3 times what your credit cards are, Megan. The carriage house was promised to me, Megan fired back. You already have the jade ring, Catherine. Don't think I didn't see you take it. At the doorway, several neighbors who had come to help Father Moore load the pies, including Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood gossip, and young Billy, the local delivery boy, froze in their tracks. They stood in the biting Providence air, witnessing the justice and redemption of a family tearing itself apart. In that moment, the silent voice of Eleanor Blackwood finally spoke. She didn't whisper. She didn't call for Martha. She stood up with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a 78-year-old woman. With one swift, decisive motion, she grabbed the massive bowl of flour. Whoosh! A blinding white cloud filled the air. Catherine and Megan, caught mid-scream, were suddenly buried in a thick, choking coat of white dust. The flour clung to Catherine's silk dress and Megan's trendy curls, turning them into pale, ghostly caricatures of themselves. The room went stone-cold silent. The neighbors at the door gasped. Father Moore crossed himself. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, the empty bowl still in her hands. The silent voice was gone. Her eyes, once hazy and vacant, were now as sharp and cold as the Providence ice. The unlikely hero had finally revealed her face. Tajanquen Nio Thu, Eleanor began, her voice no longer reedy, but echoing with the authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. I have forgotten the taste of fear. I have forgotten how to suffer fools, but I have not forgotten how to look at devils disguised as angels. She stepped toward Catherine, who was coughing and rubbing flour from her eyes. Eleanor's gaze was a transformation hook, a miraculous change from a victim to a judge. You sought justice and redemption for your husband's greed, Eleanor said, her voice a call to faith that invited the audience to witness the truth. You dug in the frozen mud for gold, but you threw away the only miracle this family ever had. The love in those letters, the shoes of the children I raised. Eleanor turned to Megan, who was trembling, flour falling from her blonde hair like ash. And you, seeking a transformation for a carriage house to hide your vanity. The silent voice hook was shattered forever. Eleanor looked at the neighbors, at Father Moore, and finally at Clara, who was weeping with a miracle faith-based relief. She thought she could silence the truth, Eleanor said, pointing a finger at the white-dusted Doutrong. But a little girl's prayers and a dog's loyalty have restored my faith. The justice and redemption was no longer a plan. It was happening. Eleanor Blackwood wasn't a person to be managed. She was the unlikely hero who had used her silence to see the rot. Father, Eleanor said, her voice softening as she looked at the priest, take the pies. They were made with the only genuine transformation in this house, the love of Clara. As for the rest of you, she said, looking at the flour-covered Dao Truong and Dao Thu, clean yourselves up. The justice and redemption has only just begun. The neighbors watched in awe as the silent voice woman led Barnaby toward the window. The call to faith had been answered. The mask was off, and for the first time in years, the Blackwood estate felt as though a miracle had truly occurred. The dust had barely settled in the dining hall, but the white flour coating Catherine and Megan made them look like statues of a bygone era, crumbling under the weight of their own deceit. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her presence no longer that of a frail invalid, but of a matriarch reclaiming her sanctuary. The justice and redemption hook was in full effect, designed to satisfy the deep-seated desire to see the wicked punished and the good rewarded. Catherine, wiping the chalky powder from her eyes, let out a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. "You've been faking? All this time you've been watching us like some voyeur? You're insane. Father Moore, you saw that. She's a danger to herself and everyone else. We're taking her to the city hospital immediately." Megan joined in, her voice shrill and trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "This is elder abuse in reverse. You tricked us. You let us dig in the mud while you sat here laughing? We'll have you committed, Eleanor. We'll have you declared legally unfit by sunset." Standing at the back of the room were Arthur and Mansu, Eleanor's eldest sons. Arthur was a man whose expensive suit now seemed a size too large for his shrunken dignity. Mansu stood with his shoulders slumped, unable to meet his mother's iron blue gaze. They were the silent voices of the family's failure, men who had allowed their wives' greed to steer the family ship toward the rocks. As their wives screamed, the brothers did the only thing they could. They bowed their heads in profound humiliation. "Enough!" Eleanor's voice didn't need to be loud to command the room. It was an emotion-based hook, causing a shock that froze the very air. "You speak of hospitals and courts as if you have any ground left to stand on, but you have forgotten one thing. This land, this house, and every tree you tried to uproot belongs to me." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a heavy, notarized envelope. "Yesterday, while you were busy plotting to silence the truth, I met with Mr. Henderson." Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime attorney, a man as dry and unyielding as the Rhode Island coast, stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway. He had been waiting, a silent witness to the justice and redemption about to unfold. "Mr. Henderson has finalized the transfer," Eleanor continued, her eyes fixed on Catherine. "The 30 acres of timberland, the North Ridge, and the meadows are no longer mine to give. I have donated the entirety of the Blackwood land to the Providence Children's Trust. It is to be the site of a new orphanage and a community farm. If you believe God still performs miracles, this story will restore your faith, because those children will have the home you were so willing to sell." Catherine collapsed into a chair, the flower on her face streaked with tears of financial ruin. Megan began to hyperventilate, realized her carriage house wedding venue had just vanished into thin air. But Eleanor turned her back on them, her gaze softening as it landed on Clara. The unlikely hero hook was now focused on the one person who had sought no reward. Clara stood near the 300 pies she had baked, her hands still stained with apple juice, looking lost amidst the family war. "Clara," Eleanor whispered, a silent voice hook, emphasizing a soul connection that transcended the language of greed. "Come here, child." Eleanor took Clara's trembling hand and placed a small, cold iron key into her palm. It wasn't the key to a safe or a land deed. It was rusted, smelling of iron and old earth. The others looked for gold under the oak tree. They looked for deeds in the study, but they forgot that the heart of this house is where the spirit is fed. "Go to the wine cellar," Eleanor commanded gently. "Behind the racks of the 1945 vintage, there is a small wooden door. This key opens it." Clara looked at her sisters-in-law, then at her husband, Kyung-soo, who had just entered and was watching with a call-to-faith hook in his eyes, an invitation to engage with a deep emotional connection. Clara nodded and hurried toward the basement, followed by a curious Father Moore and a silent Mr. Henderson. They descended into the cool, damp dark of the cellar. Clara found the hidden door. The key turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. Inside was not a hoard of gold bars, but a meticulously organized vault. Shelves were lined with hundreds of handwritten ledgers and thousands of glass jars containing preserved heirloom seeds. But in the center sat a locked leather case. Clara opened it to find a transformation hook, a miraculous change from pain to happiness. Inside were the original trademark patents for the Blackwood apple pie and Blackwood sage crust, recipes that had been the secret foundation of the family's early wealth. Along with the patents were contracts for a national artisanal distribution line that had been quietly earning royalties for decades, worth millions of dollars in a trust fund that Catherine and Megan never even knew existed. It was the silent voice of the family's legacy, a connection to the soul of their work that had been preserved for someone who understood its value. Clara walked back up the stairs, her face luminous with a miracle-based light. She held the leather case as if it were a holy relic. Catherine and Megan looked up, their eyes narrowing with a final, desperate spark of avarice. "What is it?" Catherine demanded. "Is it the money?" Eleanor stepped toward Clara, placing a hand on the young woman's shoulder. She looked at the flower-covered women and her shamed sons. "Vang bak roa setan bien doijat," Eleanor said, her voice a lyrical call to faith. "Gold and silver will eventually vanish beneath the earth. Only the flavor of kindness is eternal." Catherine, Megan, you looked for a miracle in a bank account, but Clara found the miracle in her service. Eleanor looked Clara deeply in the eyes. "Kun lang guoi duin hat sung jang, yu lei lin hon qua dong honai." You are the only one worthy to hold the soul of this family. These recipes, this heritage, and the trust that supports them are now yours to manage. You will use them to fund the orphanage on the land I gave away. You will be the savior this ordinary family didn't know it needed. Catherine and Megan stood frozen, realizing that while they had been fighting for the soil, Clara had been given the seeds of the future. The justice and redemption hook was complete. The wicked had been left with nothing but flour and debt, while the good had been rewarded with a legacy that would restore faith in the entire city. "Take your husbands and go," Eleanor said, her voice a silent voice that understood every tear she had hidden until now. "The Blackwood estate is no longer a bank. It is a home again." Eleanor looked at the faces around her. She saw the silent voice of her husband Henry in the way her sons laughed, and she saw the miracle of her own resilience in the eyes of Clara. The love that had been buried under the oak tree and scattered in the snow had been gathered back, piece by piece through the labor of a transformation journey. The neighbors, Father Moore and even young Billy the delivery boy, had been invited to share the feast. The room echoed with a call to faith that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the human heart. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice clear and resonant, reaching across the table. Clara looked up, her face glowing. "Yes, Eleanor." "This pie," Eleanor said, taking a small bite of the dessert Clara had prepared. "It tastes like the first day your grandfather and I moved into this house. It tastes like a miracle." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with a lyrical, reflective tenderness. She reached over and took Eleanor's hand. "It's your recipe, Eleanor. I just added the heart." As the dinner drew to a close and the guests began to depart into the crisp Providence night, the family lingered by the fire. The yellow lights of the city twinkled outside like a call to faith, reminding everyone that light always follows the dark. Eleanor beckoned Clara to the window. The old woman looked out at the hill where the new orphanage was being built, its foundations strong and permanent against the Rhode Island winter. She looked at the dog Barnaby, the unlikely hero who lay sleeping at Clara's feet. Eleanor squeezed Clara's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She leaned in close, her eyes brimming with a peace that surpassed all understanding. "Vang bak roi se tan bien," Eleanor whispered, repeating the lesson of the heart. "Only the flavor of love remains. Kon jan lamrat tot, Clara. You have done so well." She paused, a long, tired sigh escaping her lips. "Koi kung tajan ko di ngungon roy." Finally, I can sleep well. Clara leaned her head on Eleanor's shoulder. There was no more fog. There were no more masks. Under the warm yellow lights of Providence, love had finally triumphed over greed. The justice and redemption was complete, and the Blackwood legacy was safe in the hands of the one who had always known that the greatest miracle is a life lived for others. The story of the Blackwood estate became a local myth, a miracle-based tale told to children to teach them that faith can restore what greed has broken. And every Thanksgiving, the smell of cinnamon and sage would drift from Heritage Hill, a call to faith that whispered to every soul in the city. If you believe God still performs miracles, this story is the proof. The story of the Blackwood family teaches us a profound truth that we often forget in the rush of our daily lives. The most valuable inheritance we can leave behind is not the gold in our banks or the land under our feet, but the character we build and the love we sow in the hearts of others. Like the 300 pies baked in the dead of night, Life requires patience, sacrifice, and the right ingredients of sincerity and faith. In your own journey, remember that people may try to silence the truth or hide behind masks of greed, but a soul connection built on genuine kindness will always find its way to the light. Do not be afraid to be the unlikely hero who chooses service over status, for it is in giving that we receive the miracles we so desperately seek. If this story touched your heart today, please help us spread this message of hope and restoration to others. Like this video if you believe in the power of a mother's love. Share it with a friend or family member who might need a reminder that miracles are still possible. Comment below and tell us about a Clara in your own life, someone whose kindness has been a light in your dark seasons. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of these heartfelt stories. Gracious God, we thank you for the reminder that your love is the compass that guides us through the thickest fog. We ask for your special blessing upon every person watching this today. Strengthen their hearts, restore their families, and grant them the peace that comes from a life lived in faith. May they find the courage to be a blessing to others, just as they have been blessed by your grace. If you believe that God still performs miracles and you want to claim this blessing for your family, please write Amen in the comments below.